Greetings, loyal subjects of the Imperium of Man. I am Librarian Elias of the Adeptus Astartes. I am creating a series of recordings with the intent of educating the general populace of the dangers of the galaxy. All of this information comes from the Lexicanum, provided to me by the Adeptus Mechanicus. I will be reading verbatim from their archives. This recording will cover one of the many foes the Imperium faces, Primarch the 15th Legion, Magnus the Red. Magnus the Red, also known as the Crimson King, the Sorcerer King, Cyclopean Magnus, or the Red Cyclops, is the Primarch of the Thousand Sons of Chaos Space Marine Legion. A giant in both physical and mental terms, while a mortal inhabitant of the Materium, Magnus long tried to understand and control the warp, becoming a sorcerer of formidable power. Magnus would eventually fall from favor with his father, the Emperor, and with the majority of his brother Primarchs due to his zealous advocacy and use of such power. Indeed, it would prove to be his mortal undoing, as, forewarned of Horus's fall to chaos, his attempt to use his own warp-touched abilities to alert the Emperor to the situation brought about his own damnation and the servitude to the Chaos God Tzeentch. Magnus led his own troops to the banner of Horus and fought on his side during the Great Betrayal, surviving in the events and being elevated to the position of Demon Prince. He has spent the majority of the millennia since the Heresy, ensconced atop his tower upon the planet of the sorcerers, planning the destruction of the Imperium. Magnus, as an infant, was dropped into the remote colony world of Prospero. Magnus was unique among his brothers, as he was entirely aware of his own birth and development and remembers his infancy completely. He also regularly communed with the Emperor via telepathy before their official reunion. Magnus was incredibly fortunate to land on Prospero, as anywhere else, his psychic nature would have made him an outcast, shunned and hunted. Prospero was a world of outcast human psychers, making him nothing special in the eyes of the colonists. They had chosen Prospero for its remoteness from Terra. When Magnus fell from the skies, he was like a portentous comet. His pod landed in the central plaza of all the places on the planet. Mentored by the famous psycho scholar Amon, he became a ward of the scholars and quickly gained their powers, surpassing them in many ways. Magnus soon even eclipsed Amon in power. Magnus mastered every psychic training program and soon surpassed the greatest adepts above the commune. By that time, he had so much control of his psychic powers, he was by far the greatest person on the planet. One day, Magnus performed something to change the world forever. Instead of channeling warp energy from the warp to the Materium universe, he looked into the warp, going from the student to absolute master instantly. Magnus had become the hero of Prospero when he led a campaign to purge the Psychonin from Prospero, who for centuries had wreaked havoc on the planet's population. With the threat removed, Magnus rebuilt many of Prospero's cities, most notably Tizca, which became renowned for its beauty and splendor. The chief scholars of Prospero that survived the war with the Psychonin and became the founders of the cults of the Thousand Sons. With such a mind in the warp, it was not long until the Emperor noticed him. When his fleet arrived and the Emperor stood foot on the planet, he and Magnus immediately embraced and conversed as if the two had known each other for years, as indeed they may have done, in the mind, if not in the flesh. Magnus was discovery by the Emperor in 840, Millennium 30. This may be in conflict with other sources, which state the Thousand Sons were not fighting the Crusade until at least 900 M30. Since even for a monumental task like fixing the flesh change, 60 years is a long time for a Primarch to spend on one project. Magnus may be dating his discovery as his first psychic contact with the Emperor, which would reduce the discrepancy. The Thousand Sons Magnus inherited were rife with psychic mutations, being based on Magnus's genes. He took them in as his own and began training them in the ways of the Psycho. In individuals from within the Imperium who were fearful that these rampant mutations began to voice their opinions openly, but Magnus silenced them. Magnus and the Emperor formed a seemingly close bond, reaching into the warp together. However, despite the warnings of his fathers to beware the horrors of the Empyrean, Magnus lost his right eye in a failed bargain with Tzeentch to save his legion sons from mutation. The bargain cost Magnus his eye, but for a time, the mutations did go into remission. Magnus fought bravely and successfully during the Great Crusade and became close to Horus, Lorgar, and Jagatai Khan, but he was always a wild and impetuous commander. Due to his early brush with chaos during his abduction, Magnus had an inherent affinity for the warp and the secrets within its fabric. Throughout the Crusade, he came into contact with long-isolated creatures whose psychics had been allowed to flourish. Although warned by the Emperor to shun such matters, Magnus began to gather arcane lore from across the galaxy. From this material, he compiled the monumental tome of sorcery that would come to be called the Book of Magnus. The further from Terra the Crusade went, the more strange, warp-influenced creatures they came across. This naturally made Magnus look bad, his control of the warp being similar to these creatures. Leman Russ and Mortarion both distrusted Magnus due to his use of the warp, and because of his use of deceit, where they would have used a more straightforward physical strength. Such was the distrust that Magnus and Russ almost came to blows on Archreach Secundus over the fate of the planet's great library, and heavy bloodshed was only prevented by the intervention of Lorgar. To solve this dispute, the Emperor called for a debate on the use of psychic powers. They gathered on the planet Ikea, and the Emperor presided over the debate. The Emperor finally ruled that only astropaths and navigators would be tolerated, the librarians were to be disbanded, and that sorcery was to be banned. Magnus was not pleased with the outcome. Nonetheless, he remained true to the Imperium and tried to dissuade his friend and brother Lorgar from attempting to discover the secrets of the warp for fear that it may corrupt him. Before the events of the Heresy, Magnus returned to Prospero, intent on pursuing his sorcerer's experiments in secrecy. He peered into the warp and saw a vision of Horus's revolt and roles all the legions would play, except his own, entering the mind of his brother while it was under a chaos ritual initiated by Erebus and cultists on Davin. Magnus attempted to persuade his brother away from Heresy and remain loyal to their father. When that failed, Magnus decided to warn the Emperor via an astral projection spell, because a warp storm was blocking the astropathic messages to Terra. As his astral form blazed through the warp, he came across a webway corridor that led to Terra and decided to take a shortcut through it. Magnus did not know that this particular corridor was built by the Emperor and was part of his top-secret webway project. Magnus tried in vain to breach the wall of the corridor, but then an anonymous voice within the warp offered Magnus the extra power he needed, and the overconfident Magnus accepted without question. Magnus tore a breach in the wall and followed into the corridor to Terra. Bursting through the portal beneath the Golden Throne, the breach allowed demons to invade the webway and ruin the Emperor's webway project. Enraged, the Emperor did not listen to Magnus's warning and banished him from his presence. The breach inside the webway went on to become known as Magnus's Folly. The Emperor dispatched Russ and his space wolves to arrest Magnus and bring him to Terra. Leman Russ was subsequently contacted by Horus, who convinced him of the need to exterminate the Thousand Sons, as opposed to simply returning Magnus to Terra. In the ensuing burning of Prospero, Magnus watched in horror as the great libraries and arcane archives he had worked so hard to create were burned to the ground, engaging Leman Russ in combat just as the Space Force Primarch was about to strike the final blow. Magnus and his forces disappeared into the warp thanks to a ritual he had helped prepare with Ahriman, the first captain and chief librarian of the Thousand Sons. There, Magnus found what he had wanted: unrestricted psychic powers and an opportunity for vengeance. Eventually giving himself to the forces of chaos, Magnus took all that he had from Prospero, from the Imperium into the warp, forever. Magnus's physical form had been destroyed in the battle against Russ, and now existed as a being of corporeal warp energy in the Eye of Terror, alongside his legion. However, in truth, he had been shattered into many shards, which acted independently of each other. One of these shards of Magnus later appeared as an ethereal projection on the ruins of Prospero to Jagatai Khan, and told his brother it was time to finally choose a side in the conflict. A shard of Magnus again appeared on board the Salamander's battle barge Charybdis, this time as a mental projection. There, Magnus conversed with Captain Artillus Nimon, asking him what he would sacrifice to see Vulcan restored, and seemingly helping the ship through the ruin storm. Magnus's words to Numion eventually were the catalyst for the Salamander's captain to sacrifice himself to resurrect Vulcan. The main form of Magnus resided on the planet of sorcerers, but he was deteriorating. Ahriman left to track down the shards that he could find, being given a vague location of 5 shards after Ramon temporarily transformed into the Primarch on the ruins of Prospero. Eventually, Ahriman was able to recover 4, which allowed Magnus to restore most of his lost powers and prevent his deterioration into nothingness. The 5th, representing Magnus's goodness and humanity, was located on Terra, and he notified his legionaries that they would join Horus in order to free it and restore himself to his original form. Magnus later reappeared at the head of an army of 1,000 Suns on Ulanor, answering Horus's call to muster there in preparation for the drive on Terra. Shortly before the siege of Terra, Magnus and Ahriman journeyed to the ruins of Prospero in order to recover the demon Shaitan to use it against the Emperor's psychic shielding on Terra. While on Prospero, Magnus revealed his crimes on the world of Morningstar and his subsequent erasure of the 1,000 Suns' memory of it, drawing deep disappointment from Ahriman. Magnus eventually joins forces with the traitorous Astartes led by Horus, taking part in the siege of Terra as vengeance against the Emperor for betraying him. In the early stages of the siege, he appeared on the Traitor War Council aboard the Vengeful Spirit, advising on how to disable this Emperor's psychic barrier that prevented the manifestation of demons upon Terra. During the siege of Terra, Magnus was initially absent, with not even Malkador knowing where he was or what he was doing. However, after the fall of the Lionsgate spaceport, rumors began to swirl that Magnus had been sighted on the field, and Malkador believed he was committing his psychic might to weaken the Emperor. During the raid on Luna to secure the Magna Mater by the Loyalist vessel Sisypheum, Magnus apparently ordered the Photep to aid the Loyalists in their escape. According to Alfarius, Magnus had previously asked the Alpha Legion's Primarch to not slay Nakano Sharokin, who had ultimately escaped with the Magna Mater. During the assault on the Colossi Gate, Magnus met with his fallen brother Mortarion, sympathizing with the constant pain the Death Lord was in. Magnus taught Mortarion to better control his war powers, helping the Death God Primarch regain a measure of his old composure. In truth, Magnus simply did this in order to manipulate Mortarion into launching an attack to cover his infiltration of the Imperial dungeon. Later, when the 1,000 Suns and Death God attack on the Colossi Gate fails, Magnus says the operation wasn't a total failure, as he had gotten what he wanted. Shortly after the defeat of the traitors at the Saturnine Wall, Magnus made his move, assembling all 9,000 Suns on Terra for an attack on the western hemispheric region of the palace. During the battle, Magnus's forces achieved a breach after Magnus himself entered the fray and hurled the dying Capital Imperialis, an Imperial war tank named the Kasisatra, into the palace walls, but were apparently repelled by Bodvar Bjarki and his wolves alongside Atog Abdemi, Bertik Saitos, and Eigen Gargo, all members of the Salamander's Legion. However, this was just a ruse by Magnus, who used the chaos to infiltrate the Sanctum Imperialis alongside Ahriman, Menkara, Amon, and Atrahasis. Psychically cloaking themselves as Blood Angels, Magnus and his entourage moved to the Great Observatory, where the Crimson King unexpectedly saved a group of refugees from Phosphex bombs. After infiltrating deep beneath the palace via the Hall of Lang, Magnus and his sons came before Malkador and Levius Sarika, an immortal human called a Perpetual at the shore of a great underground lake. Malkador bid Magnus to play a game of regicide with Sarika, and it soon became apparent he was attempting to turn the Crimson King to his cause. However, when Malkador revealed the lost shard of Magnus on Terra was now out of his reach, having since been implanted into the Grey Knight Janus, the Primarch became enraged and seemingly killed Malkador. Though visibly shaken by what he had done in his rage, Magnus nonetheless decided to move into the Imperial throne room and kill the Emperor. As they moved deeper into the Imperial dungeon, Magnus and his entourage are next confronted by a projection of the Emperor dubbed Revelation in the Halls of Victories. Revelation led them to the throne room, where Magnus came before the Emperor on the golden throne, determining to go through with his vow to slay his father. Magnus obliterated the projection of Revelation and powered up his staff to deliver a killing blow to the Emperor upon the golden throne. However, before he could carry through with the act, he was blocked by Vulcan as his Thousand Sons engaged in battle with Vulcan's Drakeward and Byaki's pack. The Emperor's eyes suddenly opened, and Magnus found himself floating through the ether with his father and witnessing the rise and fall of the galaxy's many empires. The Emperor showed Magnus a future where the Primarchs never turned against the Imperium, and the last world in the galaxy was conquered in the name of mankind. In this future, Magnus sat upon the golden throne to power the Imperial Webley, but his soul was in perpetual bliss as it drifted in the Materium along the Emperor to discover the limits of cosmic knowledge. The Emperor stated that this future may yet happen, and Magnus could return to the Loyalist side at the head of a new legion being prepared for him. Together, the Emperor and Magnus would expel the traitors from Terra and undertake the Great Scouring, the Loyalist forces' counterattack to Horus. However, the price was steep, for the Emperor declared the Thousand Sons damned due to the rampant flesh change. It could not follow Magnus back into the Emperor's embrace and would need to be purged. This price was too much for Magnus to bear, and he again shook at the Emperor, but found himself in battle with Vulcan. During the battle, Magnus nearly defeated the Salamanders Primarch, but the sacrifice of Beric Zytos allowed Vulcan to seemingly pummel the Crimson King into submission. Before Vulcan could deliver the final blow, Magnus finally gave himself wholly to the powers of chaos, ascending to a new etheric form and being expelled by the anti-demonic wards of the Imperial dungeon alongside his sons. Magnus was now fully committed to the traitor cause. When Magnus next appeared, he was a winged and cloven-hooved avatar, Tzeentch. He journeyed into the Imperial Webway, enacting a psychic ritual to sap the Emperor's remaining strength, so that demons could manifest even inside the Sanctum Imperialis itself. Vulcan was dispatched by Malkador to put an end to his brother, as the Eternity Gate itself was being besieged, ignoring Magnus's lies and goadings along the way. After journeying the impossible city to the Webway, Vulcan finally came before Magnus, again ignoring his brother's manipulations, including a vision of the burning of Prospero. The two came to blows. Initially in their battle, Vulcan seemed to hit nothing but smoke, and it became apparent he was swinging his hammer at smoke. The real Magnus was behind a psychic barrier, steeped within his own ritual to weaken the Emperor. Vulcan took advantage of this by smashing through the already stressed Magnus's barrier, forcing the Crimson King to try and kill Vulcan directly so that he may be allowed to complete his work. Magnus tried every method conceivable to kill his brother. He beheaded him with his khopesh, suffocated him by turning his lungs to amber, drained him of his blood, and immolated him with psychic fire. However, nothing worked, and each time the perpetual Vulcan would regenerate and continue to hammer his way at Magnus. Attrition took hold, and Magnus grew increasingly desperate. He entered Vulcan's mind as the noble he had once been, attempting to explain his actions. Vulcan had none of it, however, scolding Magnus for his arrogance and reckless use of sorcery that had turned him into a slave to chaos. In the Webway, Vulcan stood above Magnus, ready to deliver the killing blow. Magnus used this moment to unleash the spell he had been working on, undoing Vulcan at a genetic level in a desperate bid to finally kill him. As Vulcan crumbled apart to nothingness, he was able to swing his hammer, smashing off Magnus's hand with Ur Dracul and banishing him into to the warp. After the failure of the Horus Heresy, the newly formed commune joined together with Ahriman to find a way to stop the mutation caused by their allegiance to Tzeentch. They cast a mighty spell to counter the corruption. The planet of sorcerers, the new world of 1,000 suns, was arcing with violent blue and yellow streaks of lightning. They would strike down every marine until Magnus had to intervene. Their mutations had been halted, but at a terrible cost. Their bodies turned to dust, and their armor sealed tightly shut. Magnus summoned Ahriman and his council, and railed at them for what they had done. When Ahriman protested, Magnus fought and gained the upper hand. Ahriman, no match for his Primarch, was struck down. But just as Magnus raised his fist to kill him, Tzeentch himself spoke. "Magnus, would you destroy my pawn so readily?" Then Magnus knew that his master had planned for all of this, so he spared Ahriman and banished him and his council on an eternal quest to understand Tzeentch. They still wander the galaxy, looking for relics of a former time of psychic prowess and control. It is said that Ahriman even attempted to access the Eldar webways, though this is unconfirmed. Despite knowing Tzeentch's plans that led to his fate, Magnus was beyond enraged to see that the legion he had sacrificed so much for, his legion of scholars, had been reduced to automatons who could no longer even think. With his homeworld lost and his legion in ruin, Magnus ascended to the top of his tower and vowed, as Horus had, that he would see the galaxy burn. Later, seeking revenge against the Space Wolves for the burning of Prospero, Magnus would lead his 1,000 sons in an assault against the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris in what became known as the Battle of the Fang. In the many years since the Heresy, Magnus had become increasingly aloof and detached from his legion and the happenings of the Materium. He spends much of his time in the warp, waging the great game of the Dark Gods. Sometime later in the 41st millennium, Ahriman attempted to cast his second rubric on the planet of the sorcerers to cure his legion. However, a rival group of 1,000-son sorcerers discovered that the rubric would result in the destruction of Magnus, and the Primarch ended up hijacking the ritual to assimilate within even more lost shards of himself. Magnus became near complete, but the shards that were lost were those that represented his most noble qualities. Magnus would make his return to the Materium in the closing years of the 41st millennium upon the snows of Fenris, homeworld to his greatest enemy, the Space Wolves. Magnus had been preparing for the invasion for many centuries, seeding the corruption of the Wolfen across the chapter, tainting the Wolf's gene seed in the Battle of the Fang, and using the Changeling to manipulate an Imperial attack on the world. Magnus' invasion was ultimately bested by an Imperial coalition, and he was banished into the warp by Logan Grimnar, wielding the Axe of Morkai. This in turn was irrelevant, as he had succeeded in his ultimate goal, using the sacrifice of Midgardia to transport the planet of the sorcerers over Prospero and creating a gigantic warp rift. During the Terran Crusade, Magnus once again re-emerged, this time at the head of 1,000 Suns fleet in a massive craft resembling the Great Pyramid of Zika. Magnus orchestrated a ritual that saw the expedition of the reborn Primarch Rubute Gilliman trapped in the Maelstrom. However, in truth, Magnus had already foreseen their escape from his trap, and again appeared to meet Gilliman's forces inside the webway. Magnus's plan was to trick Gilliman's Harlequin allies into opening a portal to Terra, allowing his own forces to spill through. However, Gilliman saw through the scheme and instead arrived at Luna. During the subsequent battle on Luna, Magnus and Gilliman battled one another. Magnus had the upper hand until Sisters of Silence arrived from Terra, weakening Magnus's powers enough for Gilliman to stab him through the chest. Magnus was forced back into the webway portal, and his 1,000 sons across Luna vanished with him. Magnus later appeared at the head of a great Tzeentchian host in the invasion of the Stygian sector. He reappeared on Prospero shortly after the end of the Indomitus Crusade, intent on harnessing recently discovered portals on the world to summon an army of demons. However, his plans were foiled by the Space Wolves. At the height of the battle, Magnus is distracted by Lucas the Trickster, a Space Wolf who offered him the needed spell of unlocking, which in truth was just a useless piece of paper. The distraction allowed Lucas and the last remaining wolves to escape. Since the opening of the Great Rift, Magnus intends to succeed succeed with the Emperor failed and elevate humanity to a truly psychic race, projecting a sorcerer's aura from the newly relocated Prospero. He intends to create a foothold for Tzeentch within the Materium. His aura accelerates mutations while luring psychos to the planet of the sorcerers. He attempted a ritual to achieve this during the Psychic Awakening, but was foiled by the Imperium in the assault on Soriarius. Like his brother Primarch, Magnus had a set of abilities and wargear associated with him. Magnus was above all else a supremely powerful psycho, matched in the Imperium by only Malkador and surpassed only by the Emperor. Magnus was capable of changing his size and form at will, dispatching scores of enemies simultaneously with psychic assaults and single-handedly battling titans. His psychic foresight allowed him to predict the future and foresee most events. Magnus's power was such that it's speculated that the Emperor intended to use him to power the Golden Throne, a task that quickly killed even Malkador. Magnus's own appearance is a byproduct of his psychic power, with Lorgar stating that nobody has ever seen his true form. Magnus usually relied on his immense psychic power for battle, but was equipped with regular weaponry. He was typically seen wielding a massive khopesh known as the Blade of Arnanerta, and an energy weapon dubbed the Sapphire Serpentia. He wore an ornate suit of power armor with many engravings and wardings known as the Horned Raiment. By the 41st millennium, the demon Primarch Magnus was equipped with the Blade of Magnus and the Crown of the Crimson King. Following his near death at the hands of Leman Russ on Prospero, at least parts of Magnus were scattered into several shards. These psychic phantoms have their own personality and ideals. They seemingly act independently from each other, and most were recombined with Magnus by the Cabal of Ahriman during the Horus Heresy. Known shards include the Crimson King, the Shard of Magnus on the planet of the Sorcerers, and the primary, Magnus, the Shard of Prospero. This shard urged Jagatai Khan to choose a side in the war and seemed neutral to both Horus and the Emperor. It was destroyed by the Khan. The Shard of Callista Eris found in the urn of Callista Eris' ashes, carried by Lemuel Garuman while imprisoned on Committee Sona. The Shard of Agoru, representing Magnus's warrior aspects, found on Agoru. The Shard of Cadmus, representing Magnus's quest for lost knowledge, found on Terra deep within Mount Citharon in the past. Ahriman had to travel into the past to reclaim the shard. This shard came to the aid of the Salamander's first captain, Artelis Numion, aboard the Fire Ark and guarded the vessel, which was carrying the remains of Vulcan, the Ruin Storm, and to Nocturne. The Shard of Nikea, representing Magnus's feelings of betrayal, found on Nikea. The Shard of Terra, representing Magnus's noble virtues. It was kept by Malkador the Sigillite on Terra, and the reformed Magnus declared that they would aid in the Horus's assault on Terra to recover it. Meanwhile, the shard had stalked the Imperial dungeon and was eventually sealed into the body of Reveal Arvida by Malkador. The ritual did not go as planned, and a new being emerged, neither Arvida or Magnus, known as Ianius. During the Siege of Terra, Magnus attempted to recover the shard and flew into a rage when he was told by Malkador that it was now out of his reach. The shard of the Anathenum of Callimachus, representing manipulation, secrets, and change, was attached itself to the Anathemum to plant the seed of the second rubric in Ahriman's mind. The Vengeance of Magnus, a shard representing Magnus's wrath and anger, which transformed into a demon-like entity and attached itself to Astreos the Oath-Taker. It was consumed by the Crimson King after the second rubric. And finally, the Shard of Ahriman, which unbeknownst to its host, lived inside his mind palace. This concludes the information regarding Magnus. More in-depth information regarding him will be recorded at a later date. This is Librarian Elias, signing